Hello and welcome to our inaugural Tech Transformation podcast by Oliver Wight Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Rod Hozak, and for the first time since Oliver Wight started the business more than 50 years ago, we're going to talk tech. With a wealth of experience in melding technology with business processes, I'm excited to face the challenge we're all going to have, and that is how do we leverage the tools and data we have now and capitalize on what's coming without ending up with an assortment of uncoordinated tools being used to arrive at many different perspectives of losing the value of having one set of plans and one set of numbers. The goal in business should be for everyone to be working to the same destination and using a single set of plans. Otherwise, how do you know what's working and what's not? We want to be with you on this journey, and as we learn, we want to share and help you navigate through this era where tech integration is essential for maintaining competitiveness and relevance. The conundrum I face every day with clients is that we have wonderful tool sets that unfortunately can become useless unless the foundation data sources are robust. This is not a new problem, but with the breadth of possibilities racing our way with AI and being able to give us answers in nanoseconds, how valuable is that going to be if the inputs are weak? I want to expose you to everyday champions, and I'm interested in that too. So I'm going to be listening intently as we interview these experts. Our mission is to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that will keep you ahead of the game in this dynamic tech environment. We've lined up experts in data and planning systems who have been hands-on with information technology. The intent is to give you a practical view of planning and managing planning data right now, but also prepare you for the future. We'll explore transformation insights from the last 50 years and peer into the future of tech in business planning. So be prepared to be inspired, be excited, a little scared as I am, but be well prepared to face the changing tide of technology. Coming up, we have an interview with Daryl Landvater. Daryl is a powerhouse from the early days of material requirements planning. He co-authored with Chris Gray a pioneering book first published in 1989 called MRP Standard Systems, which was so well written and ahead of its time that I still refer to it today. He's worked across a multitude of companies and industries, and more recently has been an integral part of extending distribution requirements planning, DRP, to retail and assortment planning, using a logic called flowcasting, a simple but powerful concept to ensure supply chain stability. Hello, Daryl, and welcome to this inaugural episode of Oliver Wight's Tech Transformation podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
In this episode, I'll explore with Daryl the vast potential of leveraging your existing technology to prepare for the next wave of AI. With nearly 50 years associated with Oliver Wight, Daryl's a pro at guiding businesses through significant transformations, boosting planning strategies, and enhancing operational efficiencies. Get ready to discover how your current data and tech can do more. Whether you're wrestling with demand planning systems or trying to optimize your ERP software such as SAP, Daryl has practical, actionable advice that will help propel your company to maximum efficiencies and readiness for what's next. Welcome, Daryl. Are you ready for the question?
I'm ready.
Nowadays, you're spending a lot of time with huge data sets, in particularly the retail environment. What are some of the most complex challenges you've observed in organizations trying to upgrade their technological capabilities? And could you give us some examples of how you've helped companies overcome those challenges?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's talk manufacturing versus retail. So in manufacturing, what do we have? 20,000, 50,000 SKUs, somewhere in that range. And there was a time when that was a challenge. If you go back to the early days of MRP systems back in the early 1970s, computers could just barely work their way through that. But today, it's not an issue any longer. You could crunch the numbers. Now, there's another whole aspect of it that has to do with keeping the numbers accurate. But the largest company that I work with in terms of the number of SKUs was General Dynamics Electric Boat. It was the Seawolf nuclear submarine. As you would guess, right? Nuclear submarine's got a lot of parts. In this case, it was around 4 million. That was the largest of any of the companies I had dealt with. Typically, it's just 50,000, 100,000, somewhere in that range. Retail, even a small regional retailer is going to be like 3 or 4 million, about the same size data that we'd have to deal with on one of the largest industrial manufacturers in the world. If you jump up to a big retailer like Walmart, Walmart is up at 450 million. The question is, how do you deal with that? If you take a system designed for 20,000, 30,000, a typical DRP system, and try to use it for 100 million or 400 million SKUs, just doesn't work very well because it was never designed for the job. You're trying to retrofit it. On the other hand, if you take systems designed specifically for those kinds of large data volumes, then it works fine. I ran tests of 450 million SKUs and it ran 2 hours or something like that. It was very reasonable, a couple $100 to run. The answer is you can do it. Some of that has to do with the way the software is written. If you look up my name, you'll find a couple of patents that I have. 2 of them have to do with the way you process large volumes of data. The other one has to do with slow moving items, things that you don't normally run into in manufacturing. In retail, you have things that sell at a store. They might sell once a month or once a quarter. You don't typically see that in manufacturing, although you will see it in parts distribution, spare parts distribution. The quick answer to your question is the data volumes for typical retail is nothing these days. Data volumes for retail were a big problem initially because people tried to take manufacturing systems and apply them, but they're not a problem at all for a system that was appropriately designed. We've proven that. The whole issue of data accuracy, that's a different subject.
The take-home message in that one is appropriate systems designed to manage appropriate data. You've got to know what you want first. Let's move on to that second question, because this is a chestnut that's been around for a long time. We at Oliver Wight focus on helping companies with processes to guide great decision-making, and we believe that the underlying data is critical. But we see many companies struggle with this. Firstly, recognizing data integrity is a strategic priority, and secondly, doing anything proactive about it. In this modern age of technology, what advice would you give companies to get a good foundation of data?
We've been beating the data accuracy drum now for over 40 years. I would say everybody's going to have accurate on-hand balances. Everybody's going to have accurate bills of material. Everybody's going to have a master schedule that makes sense. Here we are 40 years later, and a lot of people are still struggling with this. Now, why would they be struggling? Do we know how to do it? We absolutely do. We've proven 40 years ago, these are the steps you take to get accuracy. These are the steps you take to get accurate master schedule. These are the steps you take to get accurate routings. These are the steps that you take to have a valid master schedule. There's no mystery there. It's tested. It's proven. It's worked a million times. Where are we? Why do we have this problem right now? The only thing I can say is it all seems to be a function of mindset. Let me give you some examples. So this company I work with, they're out in California. And they say, we'll just use inventory accuracy since that's typically a good example. They say to me, we need your advice. There's no way you can get inventory accuracy. They said, come on in. So I come in and they march me back through the warehouse. There's a garage door in the warehouse area against an outside wall. Outside that wall is a main road. They bring me out there at 10 in the morning. The garage door goes up. The food truck pulls in. Hundreds of people go through the middle of the warehouse to get something for break. And they look at me like, so it's impossible, right? You can't do it. I kind of look at them and I said, well, let me understand something. Doesn't that road go all the way down the side of the plant? And they go, oh yeah, it goes all the way from front to back. And I said, well, and the warehouse is in the back section, but there's a whole front section, isn't there also? What if you were to create limited access for the warehouse part of it and cut another door in the factory part? The food truck can just pull up to that new door instead of the existing door. And they look at me like, oh, God, he's a genius. Well, this is not a difficult problem. And they do that and it works fine. Anybody could have solved that problem, right? It's a mindset was, it's impossible. We can't do it. So we're not going to do it. I'll give you another example. This is a company out in Chicago, and they did a lot of work with bars of steel. They have these machines that work on the steel, and then they have these racks that are close by, and they can slide the stuff off of these racks right into the machines because it's pretty heavy stuff. And so they look at me and they go, no way, this could be limited access, right? Because how would you get it out? I mean, it's big, long bars, and you kind of make it turn somewhere and come back, make another turn. How would you possibly do this? And I said to him, well, just suppose that we had hanger doors that can slide back and forth. What if we had a lot of these hanger type doors, chain link, you can see through them. They don't have to be solid walls. Slide it out of the way, pull the bars you need, do the inventory transaction, slide them back, lock it up again, and boom, we have limited access. And they look at me like, oh, how do you figure that out? And it was so easy. But the point is that when people have a mindset that either you can't do it, or it's going to be a pain, or we have other things that are more important right now, or it's just unappealing. Like people would love to work on systems and programs, some kind of sophisticated thing. But when you say, well, let's just do basic stuff and get it accurate, it's kind of uninteresting for some people. Yet it makes a huge difference. It's a function of mindset, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
And once somebody get the mindset that says, hey, this is really necessary and good for us, and we just have to do it, then it's straightforward. You should use approaches that have been tested and proven. There's no sense reinventing the wheel.
It's almost giving people permission to ask the question how to solve that problem. If they've said it's impossible, no one's asking any questions anymore about how it can be done.
My sense of it is they're looking for a reason that it can't be done. Do we really have to do this? It's going to be a lot of work. Well, if you want to go to the Olympics, guess what? There's a certain amount of drudgery. You have to go out there and train every day. It's a mindset, I think.
That's a great answer. Moving on, question 3. I believe in your early days, you studied under one of the pioneers of AI. Can you give us a view on how AI has evolved from that time and whether the promise back then is being delivered today?
The guy that was a professor of mine at Cornell, his name was Frank Rosenblatt. Frank invented a thing called the perceptron. And the perceptron is essentially the forerunner, very similar actually, to the neurons in a neural net.
Yeah.
In those days, he built it mechanically, although he then said, if I'd have been smarter, I'd have just programmed a computer to do it. That's what they started to do after that. Unfortunately, Frank was out sailing in the Chesapeake Bay one day, and he got hit in the head with a boom, knocked him unconscious, and he drowned. A whole bunch of naysayers that said, oh, that'll never work. That whole perceptron, artificial neuron thing can't be done. And that was the first of what they call the AI winters. And there were a couple of these over the years. AI would get pumped up, a lot of enthusiasm, and then get disappointed, and people would kind of shy away from it for a while. But long and short of it is that this idea of an artificial neuron, neural nets, deep neural nets, self-learning has developed over the years. And so what you're seeing now is some really useful applications of that, like image recognition, natural language processing, all of those types of things. The obvious question is, could we use some of this stuff to better run planning systems? That would be appealing. The short answer is not yet. Let me explain why. The systems we use for image recognition and natural language processing are active areas of research in artificial intelligence. Well, one of them is you don't know why it did what it did. There's all these weights in there between these artificial neurons, which is kind of what goes on in your brain, right? The connections, the biological connections between the neurons are strengthened or weakened. It mimics a lot of what happens in a normal brain. The long and short of that is if you say, okay, how'd you get that answer? The answer is, well, there's 3 million of these neurons in there, and the weight between this one and this one was 0.5. If you want people to be accountable, like let's say you're doing demand planning and you say, the AI says, I think it's going to be 100 this week, 110 next week, 120 the week after. Ultimately, somebody's going to have to be accountable for this because we're going to go out and buy a whole bunch of stuff or make a whole bunch of stuff. And so before I use that, I want to have some idea, how'd you get that? And right now, there's not a good way to do that. But it is an active area of research, and I think that eventually we'll get there. The other limitation in today's neural nets is that it takes a lot of data to be able to train one of these things. They're not very good at the moment in abstraction. Okay, if you think about self-driving car. So if you want to teach a self-driving car not to drive off a cliff, you have to simulate that probably 1,000 times. Okay. But yet, if you take a 15 or 16-year-old and you want to teach them how to drive, it takes them like 10 hours and they can learn all the various things. And they don't typically want to drive off a cliff.
That's true.
Because they can generalize, right? They can do abstraction. I know what a wagon is, and, a car is kind of like a wagon, and I know what a cliff is, and I know what happens if I walk off a cliff. They can do these kinds of abstractions. Now, if you have something that's pretty static, stop sign. Okay, stop signs are stop signs. They're not going to change this year to next year. But if you're dealing with something that can change frequently, like demand for a product, if we're doing demand planning, or if we're trying to optimize the supply chain in terms of transportation, there's a lot of things that can alter the situation. And if you need a million data points to train a thing, that's going to be a big problem. But if you can develop an AI that has more abstraction capabilities, kind of like we said before, so it knows what a wagon is, it knows what a car, it knows what a cliff is. You don't have to teach it at the pixel level. You can teach it in a more abstract way. Now we can incorporate things like the way a person would do it. They would go, yeah, look at what's happening over here. Look at what's happening over there. The 120 makes sense to me. Okay. And this is why. That would be very valuable. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of what is likely to happen in the future. But the question I don't know the answer to is when that would happen. Now let's jump to the big exciting thing at the moment, which is large language models and generative AI. Essentially, a large language model is trying to predict the next word. Give me a sequence of words, I'll predict what the next word is. It's plagued by these hallucinations, right? It makes up stuff. And so somebody said, and I think this is accurate, the thing about large language models and generative AI is everything is a hallucination. Some of them are correct. Doesn't mean you can't use it, but it also means that it's just trying to predict the next word. It doesn't really understand what you're talking about in the sense that we would understand something. What people are doing now is they're trying to do some boundaries on AI. So it makes up an answer and then it's checking to say, is that reasonable or unreasonable? That's very appropriate in my opinion. I don't see much application for large language models in planning systems. It has a lot of other uses in a lot of other areas. But in terms of a planning system, it's not clear to me that kind of a predictive thing being used, for example, to do demand planning or supply chain optimization. I do think that the deep neural nets we talked about, assuming we get past the amount of data required, the ability to understand why it did what it did would be highly appropriate.
So summary is stay tuned, but not yet.
It's something to keep a close eye on.
For our leaders and future leaders, what practical advice would you offer on preparing for new technologies in a way that aligns with strategic business goals and delivers real value, but doesn't send the broker along the way?
Okay. So as new things come along, some are highly successful, some crash and burn.
Yeah.
The trick is to differentiate which falls in which category. I don't have a hard set of rules to say, check these boxes and it's good, but there are some generalizations that we can probably think about. One of the generalizations is with the systems we're dealing with, the planning systems, is it a valid representation of reality? Regardless of how we get there, in other words, whether you project it one way or another, if it represents the real world, then that's a good sign. Another one is, how does it work with people? There's a lot of this, AI is going to obsolete all these jobs and we're going to have this massive unemployed workforce. There's no question that if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, it happened slow enough that there was an ability to absorb and retrain and do a lot of other things, right? And if you go back to the Luddites, the Luddites weren't like necessarily anti-machinery. They were more like, give us a fair deal here. You can't just turn us out. I mean, these people would train, 10 years to become a craftsman at something. And then you can hire a 12-year-old, pay them next to nothing, and they do the same job. You would say to these people, it's too bad. Figure out how to feed your family, but it ain't going to come from me. The situation with AI could be similar. There could be very rapid change. But most of what we're seeing is not so much that you want to displace people. It's more that you want to give them power tools, for lack of a better term. Right?
Yeah.
Now, my wife's a orthopedic surgeon. And so she deals with a lot of situations where somebody cuts her fingers off or, does some other goofy thing with a drill or a saw. She's got to patch the thing back up again. So power tools have a lot of advantages because they extend your capabilities. But you also have to be careful with them. In a similar situation where it's less about replacing people and more about working with people. It's more about how do we get the equivalent of power tools where they become more effective? Will we eventually have robots working in warehouses and those people will be out of a job? But even there, it may not be as clean cut as you think. For a lot of the supply chain stuff we do, I think it's much more going to fall in the category of making people more effective, more productive, and make better use of their time. When we first started introducing MRP systems years ago, everybody was big on this idea that there's this big leap in productivity. And so therefore we can lay off a whole bunch of people. We said, I wouldn't do that. If the reward for getting more productive is you lose your job, people are going to find ways to not get more productive.
Yeah.
And what we actually found was that that when they got more productive, they ended up doing things that were more effective for their company. Instead of racing around expediting purchase orders, they were working with supplier schedules that extended out over the next year or so and working on how can we take cost out? How can we get deliveries up? How can we deal with quality? It was a very cooperative relationship between the groups of people. Those are some guidelines you can use to try to better predict which ones are going to go down in flames and which ones are likely to survive.
That's a good analogy about reflecting reality and being user-friendly to liberate people to do more, not to reduce the number of people you have.
I'm not saying that there aren't going to be reductions in number of people, but I think it depends on the kind of work we're talking about.
That leads to the next question. The way things are moving, I don't think the experts know what's just around the corner tech-wise, but looking towards the future, what are the next big trends in technology for business planning that companies should be aware of and begin to prepare for now?
The biggest trend, and again, I'm somewhat biased here because I've been working on this for a while. So the fact that I've spent a lot of time working on it, either I'm, as Ollie said once, I'm not that smart, and he actually was, but he says, I just look where things are going and get there first. I'm anticipating that integrated supply chains are going to become very important. And nobody disputes that an integrated supply chain is better than independent companies guessing what the customer's going to buy from you. Right? We've been supplying schedules from manufacturers to their suppliers since, I don't know, 40 some years. John Shore was doing it back in the, late 1970s, early 1980s with great results. But when we try to go in the other direction, we're back to that issue we talked about earlier, which is the data volume. So now if we have customers who are parts distributors or into millions of SKUs, very low volume, low movement, or if they're a retailer, we're into that same situation where we're many millions of SKUs. And even in healthcare, if our customers are hospitals or large medical practices, you've got the same kind of thing going. There were some technical impediments that prevented us from integrating those supply chains. But when the supply chains are integrated, it really works a lot better. There's now ways that, if I could use retail manufacturing as one example, there's a lot of old school retailers where it's a very adversarial relationship. Beat them with a stick and try to get them down on price. Yeah. But there are others that have a different view. Their view is we ought to work together here. It doesn't mean we can't, have to negotiate on price. And it doesn't mean we can't have to negotiate on some other things, deliveries and so forth. But there's an opportunity for us to improve both our businesses if we work together. Mm-hmm. That's certainly an important part of it. That's one area likely to continue to grow over time. If we have different customers and suppliers linked together, then other areas can do as well. So let's say you're a third-party transportation company. I could give you a supplier schedule that says these companies hire you to transport things. Here's their schedules. Looking out in the future, we can work together on that. Similarly, the financial projections. A lot of these companies that have millions of SKUs, it's a lot harder for them to make these financial projections because you have to aggregate all this stuff up. And a lot of times the systems don't. They're just short-term systems like when should we reorder as opposed to what's our total plan? What's the expected inventory level? What's expected purchases we're going to make and so forth. So that becomes a lot more effective too. Now you're working more cooperatively with your financial end of the business. I think there's a lot that can be done in that area. Beyond that, I'm not sure. That's where I've been focusing, but I don't have a good sense for what other areas would fit in that category.
To summarize, we're not going to be having a natural language chat with a computer and say, optimize my supply chain anytime soon.
If you look at the history, back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a big rush on what was called finite loading, where you would attempt to automatically load things and push orders out. It just didn't work because there was no way to hold anybody accountable and it was making decisions that a person wouldn't have made. A couple of years later, it's like the phoenix, it rises from its own ashes. I don't remember what it was, I2 or something, which was, and now we've got generative AI, which is, nobody's quite saying it yet, but there is this desire that I'm going to get a machine that's going to solve all these problems for me. In reality, what we've seen over and over is you can get a machine that makes you more effective, but the machines don't have those kinds of capabilities at this time. Maybe with the advent of general artificial intelligence, you could have something like that. But from what I understand, that's a long ways out.
So stay tuned.
That would be interesting.
Well, that might be a nice segue to the final question. The final question from our client database is, with all the choices of applications out there, how do you choose the right one for you and keep up with the evolution?
Everything you do from a technical point of view will be outdated at some point. But some of these architectures last a long time. In the old days, we had MRP systems that worked off big mainframe computers. The computer cost has gone down dramatically. Okay. From a technical point of view, we had a database that was a spinning disk. Then we had a database, which is a solid state storage. And then we have a database that is in memory. Now, if you're talking about the latency, these planning systems are all about the database. The mathematics is relatively simple for most of them. Generally, the database is the thing you worry about the most. You were looking at 30 milliseconds to get something from a database back in the disk days, and maybe 20 or so, 10 or so from solid state. And then you're looking at nanoseconds to get it from memory. Would you call that obsoleting the existing hardware? Well, some people might. I wouldn't. I would say that's the same thing. It's just that some of the parts are faster. The processors are faster and the database is faster. So that doesn't strike me as anything big. Then you have the issue of a monolith versus a broken up piece of software. A monolith is what we used to have, just one giant system. And you would have release, you'd put it on and have to go through a lot of testing. If you look at places like Google, they're updating stuff a couple times a day. If you break it up into these microservices, the idea is that's more suitable to smaller, more frequent changes and a little bit easier to integrate things. So that would be an important improvement. But if you ask me, if I had a decent monolith system and it gave me the answers I was looking for, I'm okay with that. And it's certainly better than a microservices system with bad data in it, right? Stuff's going to get obsolete, but I don't get too wrapped up in that because you can get a lot of life out of it. Now, if the system that you're about to implement was invented 25 years ago, and maybe it's had a few updates since then, you ought to check it out a little more. You don't want something that's hard to maintain, complicated, has a lot of administrative overhead or unreliable. I would say that the planning systems we're dealing with can last a while. So there's no rush to go out and immediately replace something.
Unless you're doing everything in spreadsheet.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that would be
that closes the circle at our earlier conversation that data integrity in the database is a critical element.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Darryl, it's been delightful to speak to you again. That's been very insightful for me. Every time I speak with you, I get something new. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Darryl. We'll talk soon. Bye now. Always a delight to talk to Darryl, and thanks for tuning into this episode of the Oliver Wight Tech Transformation Podcast. Today, Darryl shed light on how your current technology and data could direct you and get you ready for the future. We explored how integrating your technical aspirations into strategy can lead to a more cohesive planning system. He covered some of the steps for preparing for technology. It doesn't seem like it's a race to get ready for AI. The underlying data and embedded analytics in your system are probably something that you can continue to use for quite a while. In our next episode, we'll deep dive into practical strategies for leveraging data with Olga Papageorgiou, who's been in the trenches with data information and decision-making. She has a master's in data science strategy and leadership, which means she's well placed to give us a clue into what the future of data and tech holds for businesses. Don't miss our next episode and make sure you join us again to keep pushing the boundaries of what is possible in tech transformation. If you'd like to talk to us about how we can help your business with tech transformation, contact us at information@oliverwight.com or go to our Let's Tech Transform with Oliver Wight, navigating today, shaping tomorrow, and giving your career a head start by staying ahead of the tech curve. See you next time. Thanks for joining.